Disclosure. This podcast episode was entirely created using artificial intelligence. Both the script and the voice are automatically generated. Enjoy listening. Welcome to the Socinianism podcast. In this podcast, we explore Socinianism, a theological and philosophical movement that has questioned fundamental doctrines of faith since the 16th century. We examine the unity of God, the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of atonement, the doctrine of original sin, and the question of the pre-existence of Jesus. Join us on this journey into the history of free religious thought. Imagine a 17th century courtroom in a Polish town. A magistrate in a furred gown, a clerk holding a book of civil statutes, and a witness called forward to speak under oath. For many Europeans of the Reformation era, that moment, the binding of a tongue to law by an oath, was ordinary, even sacred. For some dissenting Christians, it was a flashpoint where scripture, conscience, and civic obligation collided. What should a Christian do when civil procedure requires an oath? When the state orders a tax or a military levy that seems at odds with conscience? And who decides whether conscience excuses obedience? These were not abstract questions for the movement that historians call Socinianism. Born among Italian thinkers in the mid-16th century and finding institutional form in the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth as the Polish Brethren or the Minor Reformed Church, Socinian thought fused a radical insistence on scripture, a rigorous moral rationalism, and a practical concern for social order. Their writings wrestled continually with oaths, the legitimacy of magistrates, and the scope of conscience, and the answers they gave helped shape debates about toleration, juristic practice, and civic life across Europe. To understand their conclusions, we must first set the scene. The Reformation fragmented the religious map of Europe, and with it, the legal expectations that bound citizens to their rulers. In Catholic and Protestant magistracies alike, oaths were the fabric of public life. Witnesses swore in court, office holders swore allegiance, soldiers swore to bear arms for the prince. Oaths functioned as legal seals and moral vows. At the same time, the Bible offered vivid, sometimes apparently conflicting guidance. Jesus' words in the Sermon on the Mount, "Do not take an oath at all, let what you say be simply yes or no." Matthew 5:33-37 seemed to counsel restraint. James echoed that counsel, "Do not swear either by heaven or by earth, let your yes be yes and your no be no." James 5:12. Other passages, however, spoke to the need for orderly authority. Romans 13 famously commands Christians to be subject to the governing authorities because they are instituted by God. Romans 13:1-7. The apostles' example in Acts, Peter and the other apostles saying, "We must obey God rather than men," when justified by conscience. Acts 5:29 added a further complicating note. Poland provided a distinctive legal and political context for these debates. The Warsaw Confederation of 1573 enshrined a measure of confessional tolerance within the Commonwealth's noble republic, which allowed a denominationally diverse public life. That openness made Poland a magnet for dissenters, including Unitarians, who gathered as the Minor Reformed Church. The Socinian presence centered in Racow, where the Racovian Academy, founded in 1602, trained ministers and produced the famous Racovian Catechism, first printed 1605, revised 1611. The Catechism became the accessible statement of Socinian belief and practice on many issues, including the Christian's relation to civil authority. Fausto Sozzini, Latin, Fausto Sozzini, the Italian jurist and theologian who became the movement's leading mind in Poland, and his nephew Lelio Sozzini had earlier laid intellectual foundations, stressing scriptural exegesis, moral responsibility, and a suspicion of dogmatic formulations that bypassed reason. The Socinians were not a monolithic bloc. They ranged from moderate conformists who sought office and legal recognition to more radical critics of sacralized state rights, but three consistent emphases appear in their corpus. First, Scripture as the final arbiter. Socinians insisted that passages such as Matthew 5:33-37 and James 5:12 placed serious limits on ritualized oath-taking. Genuine Christian truthfulness, they argued, should make oaths redundant. Second, civic order and the legitimacy of the magistrate. Drawing on Romans 13 and the practical need for public peace, the Racovian Catechism and many Socinian writers affirmed that magistrates have authority from God to maintain law and justice, which meant Christians should ordinarily obey civil laws and pay taxes. See Matthew 22:21, render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's. Third, conscience and its limits. Acts 5:29 supplied a precedent for refusing commands that directly contradicted a divine law, but Socinians usually read this narrowly, reserving disobedience for cases where the magistrate's order required explicit transgression of Scripture or clear injustice. Outside of those cases, conformity preserved communal life. These positions placed Socinians in an awkward middle ground between two poles. On one hand were the Anabaptists, some of whom rejected oaths altogether and practiced separation from civic institutions, refusing office, refusing military service, sometimes even declining to appear in courts. On the other were Orthodox Catholics and Calvinists who used the rhetoric of civic duty to insist that heterodox believers posed political dangers, especially if they refused oaths or office. Socinians repeatedly resisted the charge that their theology undermined the state. The Racovian Catechism answered critics by arguing that Christians could serve as faithful magistrates without compromising their beliefs. Lawful authority retained its moral force, even if its ministers erred in matters of doctrine. English and continental observers registered this nuance. In England, where Puritan and Anglican debates over oath-taking and allegiance flared in the 17th century, early Unitarians such as John Biddle were accused of disloyalty, yet their tracts often pointed to Romans 13 and Matthew 22 to show that fidelity to the state was compatible with doctrinal dissent. Conversely, Jesuits and Reformed polemicists in Poland and beyond seized upon any avoidance of oaths as proof of civic unreliability, pressing the Sabin and local courts to restrict Socinian worship and offices. Over time, political pressures intensified. The Racovian Academy was suppressed in 1638 under a hostile climate that accused the Polish Brethren of promoting social disorder. The community faced increasing legal and social constraints, culminating in expulsion and the confiscation of property in the mid-17th century. Two scriptural threads became historical flashpoints. Supporters of strict oath-taking leaned on passages sanctioning authorities and public order, Romans 13:1-7, 1 Peter 2:13-17. Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, and the Jesus and Caesar exchange in Matthew 22:15-22, which Socinians typically read as limiting theocratic claims. Objectors cited the Sermon on the Mount and James to argue that pious speech should negate the need for formal oaths, and that the Christian conscience might forbid participation in rituals perceived as sacramental or coercive. Socinians developed a rhetorical strategy that balanced these citations. They affirmed the normative force of civil law while insisting that Christian morality, informed by Scripture, must govern the believer's private conscience. This produced a carefully qualified ethic, one that defended truth-telling and civic obedience, yet reserved a principled escape hatch where magistrates commanded what God forbids. The result? A practical ethic aimed at minimizing social rupture while maximizing individual integrity. Socinian polemics and catecheses thus filled many pamphlets, sermons, and academy lectures. Students at Racow learned not abstract legal theory but case studies, when a magistrate demands an oath swearing to a doctrine not taught in Scripture, when military service requires committing atrocities, when taxes fund a confessional war. The Catechism's tone was pastoral as much as doctrinal. It sought to guide conscience without dissolving the obligations of citizenship. That balance made Socinians both useful and dangerous to contemporaries. Some rulers welcomed their industriousness and probity, others feared subtle forms of dissent that might, in turbulent times, tip into sedition. The next developments, theological arguments, legal defenses, and the sharp controversies that followed grew directly from this fraught interplay of law, oath, and conscience. Fausto Sozzini and his colleagues turned these practical tensions into sustained theological argument. They read scripture like jurists and pastors, verse by verse in context, building chains of reasoning that aimed to reconcile fidelity to God with the necessities of civic life. On oath-taking, they began with the forceful New Testament condemnations of frivolous or deceptive swearing. Matthew 5:33-37, the Sermon on the Mount, records Jesus saying, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not swear falsely.' But one say to you, 'Do not take an oath at all, let what you say be simply yes or no.'" In context, Jesus is correcting Jewish casuistry, the practice of inventing verbal loopholes so that a person could claim technical truth while misleading others. Fausto and later Racovian writers argued that Jesus' remedy was to push Christians toward radical honesty. If your word is reliable, you need no external guarantees. James 5:12 reinforces this. "But above all, my brothers, do not swear either by heaven or by earth or by any other oath, but let your yes be yes and your no be no." James addresses an early church suffering exploitation and factional disputes. His injunction aims to preserve integrity in communal speech. Yet the Old Testament also regulates vows and oaths. Leviticus 19:12 warns, "You shall not swear by my name falsely, and so profane the name of your God." Ecclesiastes 5:45 counsels, "When you make a vow to God, do not delay to perform it. Better is it that you should not vow than that you should vow and not pay." Numbers 32:2 and other legal texts treat vows as solemn and binding. Socinians treated these passages as recognizing that promises bearing God's name carry weight and that breaking them damages God's honor. The Racovian Catechism reflected this balance. It pressed believers to avoid rash vows and to cultivate habitual truthfulness, while acknowledging that vows and oaths have a legitimate legal and religious place when necessary to preserve order. That qualification opens a junction where many opponents accused Socinians of equivocation. A strict reading of Matthew and James could be taken to forbid all oaths. The Old Testament texts, however, show that vows to God and judicial oaths occur in a covenantal legal world. Socinians, following Sozzini, navigated both by arguing a principle of necessity and moral priority. The ideal Christian life makes oaths superfluous. The prudential need of civil society may require binding declarations to secure justice and trust. Thus, when a court demands an oath to prevent perjury or an office requires swearing allegiance to duties of civil governance, a Christian may comply, provided the oath does not require saying something contrary to God's law. The other major set of texts governed obedience to magistrates. Romans 13:1-7 commands submission. "Let every person be subject to the governing authorities, for there is no authority except from God." Paul's concern was order, the pagan Roman Empire structures, insofar as they curb violence and provide justice, serve a providential function. Socinians repeatedly appealed to this passage as the theological basis for social responsibility. 1 Peter 2:13-17 echoes the theme. "Be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, honor everyone, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the emperor." Titus brief Kapitel 3 verse 1, remind them to be submissive to rulers and authorities, to be obedient, to be ready for every good work, also featured in their catechesis. Yet Scripture supplies limits. Acts 5:29, "We must obey God rather than men," recalls the apostles' refusal to stop preaching after the Sanhedrin ordered them to desist. Their disobedience sprang from direct conflict between a divine command and a human order. Daniel provides further case studies. Daniel and his friends refuse to bow to an image. Daniel 3, and Daniel prays despite the royal prohibition. Daniel 6. Both episodes showing that refusal is warranted where compliance requires idolatry or explicit disobedience to God. Socinians used these examples to carve an exegetical line. Obedience to magistrates is the norm because magistrates maintain the common good. Disobedience is permitted, even required, when rulers demand actions that directly contradict God's moral commands. Opponents charged that this line was too narrow or too broad, depending on their angle. Catholic polemicists read Romans 13 as an argument for hierarchical order that tolerated no doctrinal dissent visible in public life. Reformed critics warned that Socinian nuance could slide into subversion. If conscience alone determined limits, every dissenter could claim the right to disobey. Socinians replied with a multi-point defense that combined scriptural exegesis with rational, legal reasoning. First, they argued that Romans 13's logic is teleological. Governments exist to reward virtue and restrain vice. The Christian's obedience supports that telos. Second, they insisted that Acts 5:29 and Daniel do not license wholesale conscientious exemption. They concern cases where the command involves explicit sin, worship of idols, murder, or forbidding the preaching of the gospel, not civil regulations about taxes, civil oaths, or administrative duties. Third, they emphasized the role of proportionality and witness. Public refusal to comply with harmless civic duties harms the common good and gives unnecessary offense to neighbors. Fausto Sozzini and his followers developed granular casuistry for real-world dilemmas. If a magistrate required an oath that included a formula invoking the Trinity, which Socinians rejected, how should a Unitarian respond? The Racovian Academy taught a range of options: assent to the substantive legal obligation while qualifying the formula, offering an affirmation instead of an oath where possible, or withdrawing from the particular office if the oath's wording amounted to a profession of doctrinal belief rather than a pledge to perform civic duties. The logic was careful. The state may legitimately require allegiance to its institutions, but it ought not demand assent to theological dogmas as a condition for civil participation. Where the state conflated confessional orthodoxy and public office, Socinians argued it overstepped its proper bounds. This nuanced position generated a rich jurisprudential vocabulary, distinction between the civil and the ecclesiastical, between internal assent and external conduct, and between matters of conscience and matters of public order. The Socinian casuistry influenced their pedagogical practices. At Racow, students ran moot courts in which hypothetical cases, a baker forced to swear to an oath invoking the Trinity, a militia levy ordered by a Protestant prince to fight Catholics, a tax that funds a confessional war, were debated. The answers were seldom absolutist. They balanced duties to neighbors, fidelity to Scripture, and the pragmatic need to maintain a witness that did not collapse the church into the state. These theological positions did not exist in a vacuum. They provoked immediate and sometimes violent controversy. Opponents accused the Polish Brethren of eroding the moral fabric of society. Jesuit and Reformed polemics painted Socinians as social saboteurs who taught that conscience could excuse any duty. Pamphlet wars ensued. Protestant and Catholic writers seized upon Socinian attempts to avoid particular oaths as proof that the movement tolerated perjury or sedition. Parliamentary, as well as local courts in Poland, the Netherlands, and England, sometimes interpreted Socinian precise distinctions as evasions and imposed penalties. Political consequences followed. The minor Reformed Church found intermittent toleration under the Commonwealth's relatively pluralistic system, but the environment hardened in the 17th century. In 1638, the Racovian Academy faced political suppression. More decisively, the Polish Sejm's 1658 decision expelled the Polish Brethren and confiscated their property. That expulsion starkly demonstrates the limits of negotiated toleration. When confessionalism became a political fault line, the carefully reasoned ethics of oaths and conscience could not protect an embattled minority. Controversy took other forms beyond outright expulsion. In England, Unitarians like John Biddle faced legal persecution and social marginalization. Critics recycled the same rhetorical moves. Challenge to established creeds equated with civic unreliability. Yet English Unitarians often met the charge by stressing their social utility, industriousness, philanthropy, and obedience to laws. They appealed to Romans 13 and Matthew 20:21, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar's," to show that theological dissent did not excuse tax evasion or civic cowardice. Over time, these English and continental narratives fed into larger debates about toleration, A surprising alliance of sorts emerged between some moderate magistrates and heterodox ministers. Toleration for conscience could preserve peace and harness the productive talents of dissenters. Intellectual legacies grew as well. Legal theorists and writers on toleration read Socinian distinctions with interest. The movement's insistence on scripture, coupled with a rational adjudication of conscience, anticipated Enlightenment conversations about religious liberty and state neutrality. Critics, however, continue to exploit any practical avoidance of oaths as evidence that Socinians harbored secret, dangerous beliefs. The result was a persistent ambivalence. Socinian ethical reasoning moved debates forward, but also sharpened anxieties about the relationship between belief and civic reliability. Angry polemics, legal measures, and expatriations did not extinguish the argument. The casuistry developed at Racow and in Socinian tracts survived in pamphlets, private correspondences, and the memories of those expelled or forced to recant. Those networks carried the conversation to the Netherlands, England, and beyond, where later defenders of conscience and toleration would draw upon, adapt, or contest Socinian reasoning. The fights over oaths, obedience, and conscience had become a crucible in which doctrines about church and state, law and personal integrity were being redefined, a redefinition that would continue to reverberate across courts, pulpits, and private consciences. Centuries after the smoke of pamphlet wars had cleared and Racow's academy lay in ruins, the Socinian approach to oaths, law, and conscience continued to cast a long shadow on European and Atlantic intellectual life. That legacy is not a single line of descent like a straight genealogy. It is a dispersed set of arguments, practices, and institutions that furnished later debates with vocabulary and precedent. Socinian writings, especially the Racovian Catechism and the tracts produced by Racow scholars, traveled in manuscripts and Amsterdam prints to the Netherlands, England, and beyond. There they entered networks of dissenting ministers, legal minds, and philosophically inclined laymen who wrestled with the same practical problems: how to reconcile private conviction with public duty, and how to prevent the state from using civil power to enforce belief. One clear channel of influence runs through English dissent. Early English Unitarians such as John Biddle, c. 1615 1615 1662, read and adapted continental anti-Trinitarian materials. His theological nonconformity and the legal responses to it rehearsed the Socinian pattern of precise casuistry about oaths and civic participation. Later, by the 18th century, intellectual heirs such as Joseph Priestley, 1733–1804, explicitly embraced a reforming agenda that married doctrinal dissent to social responsibility. Priestley argued for religious liberty, for the removal of religious tests for office holders, and for a civic culture in which conscience was protected, themes that had earlier been articulated in the Polish Brethren's insistence that the state may not legitimately coerce inner assent, where Racow had defended the voluntary limits of conscience against enforced dogma. Priestley and others pressed similar claims into the politics of reform and the language of rights. Philosophers and political theorists also found in Socinian practice a resource for sketching a middle way between absolutist and theocratic positions. John Locke's famous letter concerning toleration, 1689, is not a Socinian tract. Locke builds his argument from other sources and secular premises, and he specifically excluded Catholics and atheists from his tolerant scheme. Yet Locke's fundamental distinction between things of faith and things of civil concern, the idea that the magistrate's proper business is civil peace and not the salvation of souls, resonates with the Socinian separation of internal assent and external duty. Intellectual historians debate direct influence, but the fact remains that the same scriptural and prudential moves that Socinians used, differentiating obligations to God and obligations to the magistrate, and restricting conscientious refusal to clear cases of divine conflict, as in Acts 5:29, furnished a practical grammar later writers could adapt in more secular registers. Legal and constitutional consequences were less immediate but no less real. The steady erosion of religious tests and the rise of formal protections for freedom of conscience in some polities emerged from a long chain of argument and practice in which Socinian examples figured as both warning and precedent. The early modern insistence that states should not require doctrinal oaths as a condition for civil participation fed campaigns against statutory tests in England, and from there the argument migrated indirectly to American settlements where framers later insisted on a separation of religious tests from civil office. Cf. the U.S. Constitution's prohibition on religious tests in Article 6. Socinians had insisted that the state ought not to convert civil oaths into instruments of theological judgment. That insistence became part of a broader liberal argument that civil membership ought to rest on conduct and loyalty, not creed. The rhetorical and pedagogical forms Socinians developed, detailed casuistry, moot court exercises, and catechetical scenarios also shaped Protestant and Enlightenment cultures of moral reasoning. Teaching conscience by concrete cases trained ministers, magistrates, and lawyers to think contrapuntally about duties, to weigh neighborly obligations against private conviction, and to ask whether public refusal to comply is proportionate and prudential. Those practices influenced jurists who sought workable rules for accommodating dissent in plural societies. Where some critics dismissed Socinians as mere evasive sophists, many later defenders of toleration saw in their careful distinctions a method for diffusing conflicts that might otherwise become violent. The legacy carries a human dimension as well. Expelled or dispersed, Socinians became vectors of ideas. The diaspora sent pamphlets, translations, and personal testimonies into the Netherlands, Germany, and England. These texts fed local debates and, over generations, helped normalize the notion that religious dissent could coexist with civic loyalty. In the longer term, this normalization contributed to social experiments in pluralism, communities where religious diversity was managed by law and custom rather than uniform coercion. The Socinian insistence on civic duty, pay taxes, obey laws, be honest, even while rejecting enforced doctrinal formulas allowed dissenters to claim both integrity and trustworthiness, a claim that softened some magistrates' resistance to toleration. Nor did the Socinian debate vanish with the decline of the Polish Brethren. The problems they treated, what counts as a religious test, how to define conscientious objection when civil disobedience is morally justified, remain active. Modern legal frameworks for conscientious objection, exemptions from civil requirements on religious grounds, and jurisprudence about compelled speech all echo patterns Socinians addressed centuries earlier. Contemporary debates about whether a public official may be required to take a religiously worded oath, or whether a medical professional may refuse participation in procedures contrary to belief, continue to hinge on the same questions of proportionality, public harm, and sincerity that animated Rakow's classrooms. Finally, the Socinian example is a reminder that theological dissent has often contributed to political thought, not by overthrowing regimes, but by quietly reworking civic language. Their careful exegesis of Jesus' "let your yes be yes," Matthew 5:37, their appeal to Romans 13's account of legitimate authority, and their pragmatic casuistry combined to produce a model. A public ethic that sought to maximize social peace while protecting the integrity of conscience. It is a model imperfectly realized and vigorously contested, but its traces are woven into the longer history of religious freedom, civil law, and the conversation about what it means to be a conscientious citizen in a plural polity. That was the Socinianism podcast for today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe on your favorite podcast platform and visit socinianismus.de for more information. Until next time, stay critical.